Hello, everyone, and it's wonderful to see you here at Our Lady of Mount Carmel Church in Windsor for another Christian Culture lecture. I'm Father Thomas Rosica in my capacity as president of Assumption University. This lecture series has been one of our flagships, one of the most significant contributions of Assumption University to the church and to the Windsor area since our origins. This afternoon we are in for a wonderful treat. Many of you have heard of Pope Pius XII. You also know about the controversy surrounding this truly great pope. I want to quote from you a few lines from Dr. Ventresca's most recent award-winning book on Pope Pius XII. I quote, "In death, much more so than in life, Pope Pius XII has become an intensely polarizing figure. To some, he is a venerable saint, and to others, he is a damnable silent witness to unimaginable atrocities in the heart of Europe. However, we might assess his pontificate in this particular way. There is no doubt that Eugenio Pacelli's pontificate left an indelible mark on the papacy and influenced the Catholic encounter with the modern world in ways we have scarcely begun to understand. Today we have with us a world expert in Pope Pius XII. Robert Ventresca is a historian and associate professor at King's University College at Western Ontario. I was a witness to his rise. As chaplain of the University of Toronto in the late 1990s, Robert was a participant in our activities at the Newman Center as he completed his doctorate. He remains one of the very happy memories I have of my years as chaplain and a teacher, a professor at the University of Toronto. He specializes in the history of 20th century Europe with a particular focus on the fascist era, post-war Italian and Cold War politics and culture, as well as the history of church-state relations in the modern era. His work demonstrates the complex intersection of religion and civil society and the enduring role of religious belief and traditions in the modern world. Professor Ventresca, Catholic, married, recent father of a young, beautiful daughter, is the author, most recently, of Soldier of Christ, The Life of Pope Pius XII, this incredible volume on Pope Pius XII, which is now respected around the whole world as an authoritative book on this great pope. His work has recently won a very significant prize, the 2014 Harry C. Koenig Prize for Catholic Biography by the American Catholic Historical Association. In the citation given to Dr. Ventresca for this book, it says that his book gives the best insight into one of the longest pontificates of the 20th century. His writing is scholarly, yet effortlessly engaging. Readers will appreciate the emotional intelligence that Ventresca brings to reading Pius's personality." End of quote. In addition to his various scholarly publications, Professor Ventresca comments frequently in the media and in public talks on issues related to contemporary Catholicism. We are extremely grateful that he accepted our invitation to come to us today as we share the wealth of the Christian Culture series with parishes throughout this diocese and throughout the city of Windsor. Would you welcome Dr. Robert Ventresca?
Thank you, everyone. Thanks for coming. I want to offer a special word of thanks to Father Thomas Rosica for his very kind words, and also to Assumption University and Salt and Light Television for their kind invitation and their gracious hospitality. It's wonderful to be here. As Tom mentioned, I had the distinct honor of getting to know him when I was completing my doctorate at the U of T in the late 1990s when he was a chaplain there. And it was really due in no small measure to his pastoral vision and his creative energies that I, along with countless other students and faculty, were able to encounter, some of us for the first time, a dynamic church that was fully engaged with the university and with the world. So I want to acknowledge here my gratitude and my own admiration for his work on behalf of the church in Canada and globally, and especially in making the life of the church intelligible and accessible to as wide an audience as possible. I would like to begin today by juxtaposing two popular representations of Pope Pius XII, whose family name, as some of you know, is Eugenio Pacelli. I've got a few slides, hopefully that will help to illustrate a few points I'd like to make. The first representation, though, actually comes from a play. It's a play some of you may recognize the name of. It's called The Deputy, by a German playwright by the name of Rolf Hochhuth. This is a fictionalized dramatic account of Pius XII's wartime activities, and condemned the Pope for his so-called silences in the face of Nazi persecution of Jews. And by silences, really what this refers to is the supposed failure during the war to speak out publicly and explicitly to condemn Hitler's murderous regime. Now, the play was first performed in Berlin in February of 1963, and it's interesting, even though it was a work of fiction based presumably on historical facts, it sparked a dramatic rethinking of Pius XII's wartime role, especially regarding his responses to Nazism and to the Holocaust. Because in the years after 1945 through to the early 1960s, there was something of a consensus, although I think it was a rather tenuous consensus, which held that Pius XII had in fact done a great deal during the war on behalf of persecuted minorities, including persecuted European Jews. So when he died in 1958, there was a long line of prominent members of Jewish communities from around the world, including Golda Meir, who was then Israeli foreign minister, as well as Jerusalem's chief rabbi, Isaac Herzog, praised Pius XII for his efforts on behalf of persecuted Jews during the war. There was a widespread conviction in many circles that the Pope had in fact worked quietly, diligently behind the scenes, often in secrecy, to save thousands of Jews from persecution and death. Now, Hochhuth's play began to really challenge and change this widely held view. And so in that sense, the play, I think, represented what we might call kind of the opening salvo in what's come to be called the Pius War. And the Pius War is this polarized, polemical debate between competing narratives of Pius as a great hero of the Second World War, a great friend to persecuted Jews on the one hand, or conversely, as Hochhuth has it, a moral coward and a political failure whose cautious diplomatic approach played into Hitler's murderous hands. Now, in the stage notes that in Hochhuth is writing to the actor, whomever is going to be cast to play the Pope, he writes something that I find very interesting. I want to share with you just a brief clip. He says of Pius XII, recommending to the actor to remember that Pius is, quote, much less a person than an institution. Grand gestures, lively movements of his extraordinarily beautiful hands, and smiling aristocratic coldness. These, together with the icy glint of his eyes behind gold-rimmed glasses, these should suffice. Now, I want to draw one line in particular from the stage notes that struck me as especially telling. The notion that Pius XII was less a person than an institution. This is how the world has come to see Pius XII, less a person than an institution. And you see it in a second popular representation that I want to share with you. It's it's this grandiose bronze monument to Pius, which sits on the main floor of St. Peter's Square. This is actually the main floor of St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. It was commissioned by a group of cardinals who had been elevated by Pius XII. It was completed in 1964. It's the work of a sculptor by the name of Francesco Messina. And so it's completed around the time that the deputy was making waves in certain circles. Now, just to describe it, again, some of you may have had a chance to actually see it. The monument really is monumental. And again, the picture doesn't really do it justice, but the statue itself is quite large, larger than life. But it sits atop this marble pedestal that is probably 8 feet tall at least. And so you've got this, again, larger-than-life figure of Pius XII clad in this massive cape. The bespectacled face of Pacelli is crowned by this towering bishop's mitre. It's really quite a jarring statue. And certainly if you're standing on the floor looking upwards, it's very difficult to actually make out the likeness of the man, Eugenio Pacelli, because in a sense he really is hidden by these weighty vestments that project an overwhelming sense of the power and the majesty of the papal office. And it occurred to me as I thought and reflected on the statue, having seen it in person several times and studying it in photos, that the monument really is designed to inspire awe and admiration in Pius XII as an institution, rather than to memorialize a dead pope. Now, what we have in both of those representations, in fact, is not Eugenio Pacelli as he was in life, but rather Pope Pius XII, as critics and admirers conversely saw him, or as they wanted him to be, a pope for all seasons and a pope for all causes. But these representations really offer our they really offer competing caricatures, even myths, if you will, of the man. And those myths and those caricatures serve to fuel competing narratives and sometimes, frankly, let's call them even competing political agendas, for lack of a better word. And I think those agendas have, over the past several decades, fueled the Pius War. In fact, it's been almost a half century now. And in the process, I think it's really clouded our judgment and our understanding of one of history's most influential popes. So, in fact, as I write in the book, he is and remains an intensely polarizing and partisan figure. And just to underscore the point, for some, he's a venerable saint, an extraordinary Christian witness. To others, he represents the silence and the timidity with which too many in the church, especially those in positions of leadership, responded to Nazism and to unprecedented atrocities that were being committed in the heart of a so-called civilized world. As you might expect, the cause to canonize Pius XII, which began at Pope Paul VI's behest in 1965, has also come to be caught up in what I call the polemical vortex of the Pius War. Now, that's not surprising, and it's perhaps even understandable. Again, after all, the fact that someone who has come to be associated, in the popular imagination at least, with the failure of the Christian churches to offer robust resistance to Nazism and heroic assistance to persecuted Jews, that this person is now a candidate for sainthood in the church is bound to arouse controversy and to offend the sensibilities of fair-minded people, especially our sisters and brothers in the Jewish community. Yet these controversies over the Pope's wartime record and over the canonization cause have, as I write in the book, produced more heat than light. The Pius War and the controversy on the whole really has warped our historical understanding. Consistently, sound historical interpretation has been sacrificed for a selective, apologetic, and often very uncritical, unfair criticism of the Pope's wartime record. Today, and this is also a hope of my book, I want to shed hopefully more light than heat by examining Eugenio Pacelli as a person rather than as an institution. And so in the brief time that we have together this afternoon, I want to share with you my reading, very briefly, of Pacelli's life and pontificate, and hopefully show how the proper methods of historical interpretation can lead us to a fairer and more insightful judgment of this man's singular, if complex, legacy and very complex life. I firmly believe that only ultimately a serene and dispassionate assessment can move us beyond the Pius War, and at the same time help us to understand fully the significance of the canonization cause for the Church and for Christian culture today. Before we turn to talk about the canonization cause and some of the controversies, I thought it might be useful to sort of do a very brief summary of the long and eventful life of Pacelli. Now, I'm the history professor. I promise I won't launch into a really, really long recital of everything that the man did. He lived a very long time and had a very eventful pontificate. But just again, to familiarize ourselves with the background here. Pacelli was born in 1876 into a prominent Roman family that had earned a name for itself and even an honorific title for its loyalty and service to the papacy at the time of Italian unification. He was ordained, this is a picture of him, by the way, with his mother, Virginia. He was ordained in 1899, and after his ordination, he was very quickly recruited into the political and diplomatic offices of the Vatican. Now, this is, again, on the eve of the First World War, a time when the Vatican was trying to modernize its diplomatic practice in order to adapt itself to a modern age. And remember, this is an age now that's dominated by modern secular nation states. His first big break in papal diplomacy came in 1915 when he was sent by Benedict XV to Germany to help sell a papal peace proposal to Austrian and German leaders. Now, the proposal, well-intentioned though it was, it came to naught. Now, Pacelli actually remained in Germany for a long time, for well over a decade, in fact, as nuncio between 1917 and 1929, first in Munich and then in Berlin. And his profound love for and understanding of German culture and the German people obviously was solidified in the 10-plus years that he spent there just after the First World War. And what's also significant, if we try to understand his later life and decisions, we have to remember that he was in the city of Munich in the immediate post-World War I atmosphere, which was characterized by this really intense revolutionary dynamic. It saw a very short-lived Soviet-style republic. That, in turn, spawned a radical authoritarian nationalist response, out of which emerged Nazism. Munich is a city in which the Nazi Party and the Nazi movement were born. Pacelli is there witnessing all of this firsthand as papal nuncio. And in Munich, too, he meets many of the formative German influences with whom he surrounded himself for the rest of his life, including the indomitable mother Pascalina, who was ostensibly head of the papal household but arguably one of the most influential figures in his pontificate. He was called back to the Vatican in 1930. He becomes Secretary of State to Pope Pius XI, Accelerate, who you see there. And of course, this makes him, as Secretary of State, effectively the second most powerful man in the Church. If we're looking for sort of loose secular analogies, kind of a prime minister or foreign minister to the Pope, to the extent that those analogies work when we apply them to the Church. What's significant, though, of course, is that he's overseeing papal diplomacy through the 1930s, obviously a very, very turbulent decade. There's a lot on his plate. You've got, among other things, the Italian fascist invasion of Ethiopia in 1935, which was the first real major threat to international peace and stability in the interwar period, the Spanish Civil War, constant fear of Soviet aggression, the spread of communism in domestic movements in Europe and even in the Americas, and of course, in all of that, the rise of Hitler and the Nazis to power. He actually oversees directly the Vatican's German files, and he is responsible in 1933 for concluding the negotiations of the controversial 1933 Concordat, the Reichskonkordat, which is a formal agreement between the Holy See and the German government. We don't have time to get into some of the specifics of it, but for many people, this was seen as a critical, fateful decision, as it were. It was a complicated decision and a complicated legacy, but for many, the association with appeasement and for a cautious diplomatic approach is associated with this one event in particular. Pacelli is elected Pope in 1939, and he was crowned in March of 1939. It was a coronation in those days, as you can see. He dies in October of 1958, so that makes it one of the longer pontificates in modern history. Just a few interesting anecdotes. The whole of the Kennedy clan actually traveled to Rome at Franklin Roosevelt's behest in 1939. Teddy Kennedy, who you see there, the young boy in the middle section at his father's hand there, Joseph Kennedy, actually received his first communion from Pacelli after he was made Pope. Joseph Kennedy and Pacelli had met in the late 1930s. There was an important relationship there. The point I guess I want to make before we sort of start to move on to talk a little bit about the canonization cause and then come back to some of the questions, especially some of the sources of the controversy, is Pacelli's pontificate was a long one. I think that's often forgotten. In some respects, it's the Cold War, the post-war, that really defines his pontificate, because he reigns for 13 years after the end of the First World War. I think it was also arguably, he was arguably one of really the first modern pope. Now, that's a label that's often given to Pope Paul VI. I don't want to get bogged down in sort of the semantics of labels and titles, but again, I think the point is simply this. Pius XII really did break the mold of papal leadership. And I think he took the papacy to places that it had never been in its engagement with the wider world, helping in very concrete ways, I think, to pave the way for the global Catholicism that we're now watching flourishing in our own time. Now, I don't want to offer an uncritical apologia of Pacelli's pontificate. In my own approach to his life and his pontificate, I take seriously the admonition of a 16th century theologian, Melchior Cano, whose work influenced the Council of Trent. Speaking of the papacy, Cano said something that I take to heart. He said, quote, "Peter has no need of our lies or flattery. Those who blindly and indiscriminately defend every decision of the Supreme Pontiff are the very ones who do the most to undermine his authority." So in that spirit, we have to acknowledge that Pius XII's leadership was, for example, highly centralized. At times it was quite controlling. At times it could, in fact, be quite severe. It allowed at times for a stagnant and repressive curial culture to contain, if not silence altogether, some of the truly innovative and faithful voices of the Church. And I think of figures like Jacques Maritain, for example, and others, in particular men like Yves Congar and Henri de Lubac and so forth, who were silenced for a time for their work. That's all a part of the record that one has to acknowledge in the pursuit of a critical historical judgment. At the same time, we have to acknowledge that the pontificate saw real moments of openness to change, real innovation, real creativity. There was a spirit of open engagement with the rapidly changing world of the mid-20th century. For me, frankly, as a biographer encountering this, it was something of a surprise. To read, for example, some of the teachings, and also to think about the very modern ways in which he engaged with the public. Encyclicals, well over 40 in all, but also hundreds of letters and speeches to all sorts of social categories. And the broad range of his teaching, when you step back from it, was marked by a complex mixture of continuity and change. And in a way, I think you might say that in the decades before the Second Vatican Council, Pius already was reading the signs of the times. He didn't say that, he didn't put it that way, but he was, in fact, I think, and in that sense certainly helped to pave the way for that transformative council. And to my mind, nowhere was his modern inclination more evident than in his interest in the natural sciences and in medical ethics, two rapidly developing fields in the mid-20th century that Pius XII had the foresight to see were going to challenge traditional Christian faith and practice in unprecedented ways. And what's very interesting when you read his speeches on this and his writings, he doesn't shrink away from developments in medical and scientific research. He doesn't retreat behind some sort of illusory protection of a reactionary orthodoxy. He boldly enters the phrase. And when you read his many addresses in the area of medicine and bioethics, for example, he spoke to physicians more than to any single other professional category. You encounter a very different Pius than the diplomat pope that you encounter in the Second World War. That cautious diplomatic language of World War II is gone. And when he speaks to medical researchers, to astronomers, to scientists, to physicians, he seems fully alive to the prophetic and evangelical dimensions of papal leadership. Now, there's a lot more that you can say about his teachings and his diplomatic field action in social and political realm, for example, as Europe and the world face an uncertain future after 1945 and on the eve of the Cold War. My point is simply this, and again, just to reiterate a point that Father Tom pointed to from my book. However we might judge his life and his pontificate, and there is much to judge one way or another, there can be no disputing that Pacelli left an indelible mark on the papacy and, as I say, influenced the Catholic encounter with the modern world in ways that we are still grappling with and really have not fully understood or appreciated. Let's turn now just to discuss the canonization cause, and then we're going to again come to some of the more specific issues, especially about his wartime role and decision-making and how the canonization cause balances some of those issues. Pope Paul VI, again, is the one who announced the canonization of the cause for both Eugenio Pacelli and Pacelli's successor, Angelo Roncalli, Pope John XXIII. Now, listen to what Paul VI said when he opened the cause. This is November of 1965. He claimed that he was doing so in order to that, quote, history will be assured the patrimony of their spiritual legacy. History will be assured the patrimony of their spiritual legacy. Paul said that the path to sainthood for both popes would proceed for, quote, no motive other than the cult of their holiness. For no motive other than the cult of their holiness. Now, the reality was a good deal more complicated than that, and I think Paul VI knew it. On the one hand, of course, again, this is all in the era of the council, and so Paul VI was mindful of competing factions within the church that were pressuring him to advance the cause of one or the other of his predecessors. And it's very interesting because the New York Times picked up on this and discussed these two factions that are at war in curial circles. This is November of 1965. You have a conservative faction that was rallying around an austere, distant, and intellectual pope, Pope Pius, of course. And then you had his successor, John XXIII, who was described in the newspaper as warmly human and simple, and thus a favorite of so-called progressives. And I mean, this probably sounds a little bit familiar, certainly when we think about the contrast that's often made between Benedict and Francis. I guess the more things change, the more they stay the same. The point, I guess, is that Paul understood that there was more to the story than ecclesiastical politics. I think he really understood that the public controversy over Hawkwood's play was cause for concern and that it had to be addressed in an authoritative way by the church. It's interesting, just hours before he was elected pope, then Cardinal Montini, who was Archbishop of Milan, sent a letter to the British Catholic periodical The Tablet. This was published in June of 1963. And he's offering his thoughts on Hawkwood's play, which, again, is performed in February of 63 and is making waves. Listen to what Montini wrote about Hawkwood's play. This is just 2 years before he actually began the cause to have Pius made a saint. He said, quote, history will vindicate the conduct of Pius XII when confronted by the criminal excesses of the Nazi regime. History will vindicate Pius XII when confronted by the criminal excesses of the Nazi regime, and he went on to criticize the manner in which Hawkwood had put together his narrative, a selective manipulation and arrangement of facts. So it's clear then that the cause to canonize Pius XII was from the start intended not just to preserve his spiritual legacy, although I think that is a sincere motivation. It also served to offer an alternative narrative, an alternative version to the one that was being offered by critics like Hawkwood. And this is a narrative that exalted Pius as a morally upright and extraordinary Christian witness who lived through extraordinarily dark and evil times. A bit of background about the cause if it's of interest. Again, I've had a chance to read it in full. Paul entrusted the work to the Jesuits, in particular Father Paolo Molinari, who was a postulator general of the Jesuits. Molinari was very hardworking, and in fact, Paul wanted the Jesuits to handle both causes at the same time. Molinari thought, no, we can really only deal with one at a time. Knowing that Pacelli's pontificate was very long, knowing that his diplomatic life was very long, he said, we'll deal with Pacelli alone and take it from that. And of course, John's cause proceeded separately. There was more to practicality, I think, to Molinari's choice. He knew of the gathering criticism of the Pope's wartime behavior, and he knew of the sort of the effects of Hawkwood's play in particular, that it was causing a stir even among scholars and certainly in the general public. And so he acknowledged from the outset that he saw the cause as a way of doing, in his own words, justice to the great personality of Pope Pius XII. The first step entailed assembling a small team, and that included a fellow Jesuit and close working companion, Father Peter Gumpel, who would later be named relator of the cause, and so he was charged with the task of preparing the positio, or the position, that makes the case on behalf of the candidate. And it's very interesting for me as a historian to read how they handled this, because they have to then spend several years gathering an impressive array of documentation. They assemble long lists of names of people from around the world who either knew Pacelli from before he became Pope, or they knew him as Pope, or they'd corresponded with him either before or after he became Pope. The correspondence could be public, it could be private. And they wanted to, they gathered a list of about 100 prospective witnesses, and they actually took sworn testimony, much of it oral, some of it in writing. And there was a questionnaire, and they asked all kinds of questions, including whether they thought there was any reason that would speak against beatification or canonization, and so forth. In any event, the depositions took the span of about a decade. So this is about a decade's worth work of historical research. And sworn statements are taken from cardinals and bishops and diocesan priests, but also from lay people, the Pope's nephews, for example, influential newspapermen, journalists from Germany, from Italy, right down to the Pope's chauffeur and members of the kitchen staff. Now, one of the peculiarities of the cause, and it's something that has, I think, caused some to look at it twice, is that when the position was being compiled, and this was completed in 2004, it was decided to dispense with a norm that called for consultation with quote-unquote experts in historical matters. I presume that means historians, right? People who know things about the historical record or about archives. And it was reasoned at the time that this stage of expert consultation wasn't necessary, since all of the relevant documentation, including material from the Vatican Secret Archives, had already been studied and much of it published, again, at Paul VI's behest, in a massive 11-volume set, which is easily available. It's actually available online now. It's a collection of over 5,000 original documents from the Vatican archives from those years, mainly from the diplomatic files of the Congregation for Extraordinary Ecclesiastical Affairs, which again, is sort of the political diplomatic office, if you will. I have it from a couple of reliable sources that the team of Jesuit scholars who compiled those volumes that were eventually published actually did manage to survey all of the relevant archival material from the whole of his pontificate, and then they chose to publish representative documentation. The point, I guess, is that by virtue of their study of the archives, those who were promoting Pius's cause said that they were given assurances that there was nothing of a compromising or troubling nature in the archives, such as might warrant suspending the cause. And yet, interestingly, the juridical validity of the cause, so the official approval from the Congregation for the Causes of the Saints, confirming that the case had proceeded according to protocol, that doesn't come until January of 1995, so 30 years after the cause actually began. It's not clear why it took so long to reach this elementary level of formal approval. There's some reason to suggest that the decision to seek expert opinion of the historical consultants may have raised, in fact, some questions about the very validity of the entire process. And certainly many historians, myself included, were perhaps uncomfortable with that decision. Again, that's not to say the cause is without its merits. Doesn't mean it's destined to fail. In fact, as some of you may know, the cause is at this point completed. It's closed, essentially. It's been given favorable assent by the Congregation, and it's waiting now, essentially, for the Pope, either the current Pope or a future pontiff, to decide whether to proceed and when to proceed on beatification and canonization. Now, the question I often get asked is, should Pius XII be canonized? I'm not going to answer that question, because that's above my pay grade. But what I will do is share with you, where things stand, and then again, sort of just as we move towards a conclusion, look at the historical record, return to the historical record, and focus again on the war years, and look at his decision-making and try to understand the cause when set against the judgment of history. Briefly, where things stand is in December of 2009, Pope Benedict XVI approved the decree acknowledging simply the quote-unquote heroic virtues of the servant of God, Pius XII. So as a result of this decree, we can now speak of the wartime Pope as Venerable Pope Pius XII. Now, with that simple decree, Pius XII moved one step closer to sainthood, even if serious benchmarks have yet to be realized before the controversial wartime Pope can be declared blessed or even saint. Benedict's decision is a step in that direction, but it should not be interpreted to mean that Pius's beatification or canonization is a foregone conclusion. Far from it. That said, I think two things are clear from Benedict's 2009 decree. First, Benedict clearly was not persuaded by the many reputable scholars who had written to the Vatican insisting that full and unfettered access to the Vatican's wartime archives is essential for a transparent historical assessment of the wartime Pope. And they argued that without a full and transparent vetting of all of the wartime archive, the historical record of Pacelli's life and pontificate remained incomplete and therefore muddy, and that this really was not a ground to proceed with the cause. Benedict obviously, and I think there's reason to believe that perhaps Francis feels the same way, having studied the contentious issue as it was presented to them, believe that there's nothing in the historical record as they see it, published or unpublished, that would impede the cause from moving forward. Secondly, and maybe the more important consequence of the 2009 decree, is it shows, I think, that the Vatican wants to, let's say, recalibrate the public measure of Eugenio Pacelli's long life as a servant of God. I think both Pope Emeritus Benedict and Pope Francis squarely are in the camp of those who believe that Pacelli worked constantly and prudently behind the scenes during the Second World War, directing papal institutions and Catholic institutions in Italy and Europe to shelter and rescue thousands of Jews. Perhaps, though, what makes the decree and even Pope Francis's public endorsement of Pacelli so interesting, maybe provocative, is that I think both popes challenged the tendency to reduce Pacelli's long life of service to the first few years of the pontificate, which of course corresponded with the Second World War. It's as if to say that the controversy over the Pope's wartime role, important as that is, in some senses has obscured our view of what Paul VI would call his spiritual legacy. Again, remember, 1965, when he started the process for both Pius XII and John the 23rd, Paul said that by virtue of the canonization causes, history will be assured of the patrimony of their spiritual legacy. Well, at least regarding Pacelli, arguably the opposite has happened. And if anything, the judgment of history and historians has tended to obscure the spiritual legacy of Pius XII. And I think it's that spiritual legacy that Benedict hoped to rescue by recognizing his predecessor's heroic virtues. Now, to have exhibited heroic virtues in his lifetime is to say that Pius XII gave extraordinary witness in word and deed to the Christian virtues, among them prudence and fortitude and temperance. Above all, it's to say that he made the three theological virtues of faith, hope, and charity the cornerstone of his conscience and activity. Ultimately, the cause to canonize Pius XII, like any cause, is grounded not on what Pacelli did or did not do as a diplomat or as pope, but rather on how he lived. Ultimately, on the extent to which he lived a so-called virtuous life. So the historical questions are relevant, but ultimately the standard here is the extent to which he lived an intense Christian witness in his personal life and in his pastoral work. Now, this is interesting. If we could just work a little bit with this idea of the virtues and how I think the cause kind of deals with it, and then we can talk a bit about the historical side of that. Think about the virtue of prudence, for example. Now, for the tradition in which Pius XII was steeped, prudence is considered, of course, to be the mother of all virtues, right? The source and summit for acting morally, justly, in conformity with God's law. Aquinas held, of course, that all virtue is necessarily prudent. So to act prudently is not to act perfectly without fault or misjudgment. The prudent person, called to act in practical ways in the world, meditates and deliberates. And so for Pius's promoters, the Pope's prudence, and they see this in his concern to avoid an explicit public condemnation during the war, which he believed could provoke unintended consequences, that explains his reticence. It's prudence that explains that reticence. And despite the constant pressure that he feels from various quarters to do so. Now, during the war, and certainly afterward, that prudence had the feeling of indifference, timidity, even failure, if you will. Even in devoutly Catholic Poland, which bore the early brunt of the Nazi onslaught in the first part of the Second World War, it seemed at the time that Pius was indifferent to the plight of besieged Poles. For the duration of the war, and again, I think the historical record speaks clearly on this one, Pius kept the public waiting for the kind of explicit, forceful public condemnation of Nazi aggression and brutality. It's there in his words and his speeches, but it's always couched in very carefully calibrated diplomatic language. That explicit public condemnation that was being demanded of him never came for the duration of the war, not even when the Nazis occupied Rome and carried out a wholesale roundup of Rome's small but ancient Jewish community in October of 1943. Not even then did he issue an explicit public protest. And tragically, just over 1,000 of Rome's Jews who were arrested in October 43 were transported to Auschwitz, and most of them were killed within a week of arriving. All of this, it was said at the time, happened, quote unquote, under the Pope's very window, and yet still no public protest, no word, clear word to the effect that the Pope was condemning such obvious transgressions of God's law. And yet, again, I think we have to contrast that with what the record tells us. Obviously, the Pope was not oblivious or insensitive or indifferent to the suffering of persecuted minorities and others. He knew of the complaints and the demands and the pressures that were coming from various corners of Nazi-occupied Europe, concerns and complaints that the Holy See was not doing enough, and especially that it was not saying enough on the world stage to condemn Nazi aggression. As Pius put it, his approach, and he speaks about this openly in the records that we do have available to us, silence, patience, speaking cautiously in public in order to preserve papal neutrality. This approach, he said, was guided by a principle of avoiding a greater evil. It's the language that he uses in one memorable correspondence with the German bishops in 1943. The principle of avoiding a greater evil was consistent with all of his diplomatic training. It was also certainly consistent with his careful character. And that approach, some would argue, saved lives. That, for example, preserving papal neutrality meant that papal institutions in places like Slovakia or in Hungary or Istanbul, in other parts of Italy, for example, papal institutions and other Catholic institutions were able to actually conduct some very heroic and successful rescue operations to the tune of saving several thousand. For example, in Rome and Italy alone, it's, again, I think, a reasonable estimate that upwards of between 4,000 to 10,000 Jews would have been saved in Rome, and it's all of Italy. Certainly that number goes up to 10,000 if you're thinking of all of Italy. And they were saved mainly because of the assistance that's given by church institutions, religious houses, as well as, of course, individuals. We know that the Pope knew of these activities and that he approved it, and where possible gave some limited material support. There are a lot of records that I have seen that attest to that, and this is all readily available to researchers and to the public, that to my mind clearly document Pius XII's knowledge of and support for various initiatives by papal representatives and church institutions to protect tens of thousands of European Jews in places like the Balkans, Slovakia, and Hungary. The question, it's the difficult question ultimately though, is was this enough? More to the point, was this prudence for which he's praised the stuff of the Vicar of Christ? Was this the stuff of a prophet, a martyr, a saint? Well, the simple fact is that the cost to beatify or canonize Pius XII will always be dogged by a great imponderable. I call it the giant what if, that lingers over his policy of avoiding a public confrontation with the Hitler regime. And it's the standard by which his pontificate has been judged wanting by so many critics. What if Pius XII had issued a forceful, unequivocal, explicit condemnation of Nazism, and especially its treatment of persecuted Jews? What if the Pope had directed openly and forcefully representatives and all European Catholics to resist actively and openly Nazi policies? How many more Jews and others might have been saved? Might the whole nightmare have been avoided? Unfortunately, for the student of history, those difficult questions are not easy to answer. In fact, they're impossible to answer on some level because they're imponderables. Ultimately, no amount of archival documentation, no amount of documentary evidence can demonstrate that which didn't happen. So it might be a useful analytical tool to speculate on possible outcome of a different approach from the Pope during the Holocaust. But the approach he chose, which was, again, to avoid a public confrontation and thus avoid a greater evil in his own words, that's what we have to go by. And so the historical question, and I think it's still an open historical question, remains, how do we assess that approach? Now, successive popes since Pius's death in 1958 have assessed that approach. and they have judged it consistent with the moral leadership expected of the Vicar of Christ. Now, it's entirely understandable that for many people, again, especially in Jewish communities everywhere, such a conclusion simply doesn't square with the facts. At the very least, to many people, the ongoing canonization cause appears premature and somewhat insensitive given the many fresh wounds and pronounced scars, and not to mention open questions about Jewish-Catholic relations. However, I think it's important to keep in mind that to say, as Benedict did in December of 2009, that Pius exhibited quote-unquote heroic virtues is not to render a final verdict on the open historical questions about his wartime activities or about the consequences of those decisions. Nor is it to suggest that Eugenio Pacelli was a perfect man or that his life work before and after becoming Pope was without its ambiguities and its shortcomings. Benedict's point simply, I think, is to say that Eugenio Pacelli lived as a virtuous man, striving in extraordinary ways to be like God. The extent to which he succeeded, of course, awaits a final judgment. Thank you.
Wow. What a panorama of history we just received. Pope John the 23rd, St. John the 23rd reminded us that history is the great teacher. Today we have a great teacher and a great historian. On behalf of all of us gathered here at Mount Carmel Church, on behalf of Assumption University, and on behalf of the tens of thousands of viewers of Salt and Light Television who will view this presentation, I'd like to thank you, Dr. Ventresca, for one powerful presentation. Thank you.